So I stopped off one afternoon on my way driving out from the city at the place to which Adele had sent him. It was an old-fashioned nerve sanitarium, which still ignored psychoanalysis, and which mainly went in for rich patients. They did, however, seem to be doing something for Wilbur, though the treatment was as gradual as possible. He spoke with admiration of the doctor, whose guidance he appeared to have accepted with a passivity surprising in him, though I thought that with his unschooled youth he had perhaps an unsatisfied need to be told what to do and when to do it. It had perhaps been behind the attraction he had felt toward the Catholic Church. In any case, he could now get to sleep on a much diminished dose of narcotics. He looked very smooth and soft, as if he had been bathed in milk, and always kept at precisely the right temperature. He had nothing very special to say to me, though he made a few woolly remarks about how utterly impossible it was for all of us to go on as we had been doing. On the whole, I was depressed by my visit. There seemed to be so very little in him when one took him out of his toy palace. He was boring, and he bored himself. I tried to talk to him about people we both knew, but he did not really want to hear about them, and his contemptuousness was tinged with venom. He did not want to believe that anybody was still able to carry on when he, as he said, had been put in the padded cell. Yet these people were mostly worthless, and what he said about them was sometimes acute. I felt either that I couldn't defend them, or that to do so would injure an ego that was already rather dangerously weakened. He had got himself into a position where he would not have to compete even with people who mostly did as little as he, but who managed to stay out of the hospital. As I glanced around during a silence into which the conversation had dropped, my eye was caught by a booklet with playing cards and rabbits on the cover. I picked it up. It was a catalog of magicians' supplies. "Don't you adore it?" cried Wilbur, immediately taking it from me. "Listen to this," he read. "Boldini's Miracle Mind-Reading Trick. Magician fans, a pack of cards, and the spectator is asked to mentally think of any card. Card is then produced from behind the back. It seems unbelievable that the magician should be able to find the card which has been merely mentally thought of. The secret of this trick, invented by me, which has baffled the keenest minds in magic, would previously not have been sold for under $200, but the treachery of a friend who betrayed it makes it possible for me to offer it for $1.50. Isn't it superb?" he demanded, and went on to read me further extracts, accounts of doves and ducks, all alive and flapping, produced from empty boxes, goldfish pulled in with fishing rods that were simply whipped about in the air, panes of glass that could be pierced with rods, and then found as amazingly unbroken as if they had been pools of water. One felt oneself a little let down after the exciting descriptions of these wonders when one came to the back part of the catalog and found quotations of prices for false thumb tips, durable rubber canaries, celluloid goldfish, collapsible carrots, and imitation rabbits that really kicked, and would give you a lifetime of satisfaction and service. "Isn't it a howl?" said Wilbur. "Isn't it the whole of life? Society, love, politics, everything? You pretend you can do the impossible. No elastics, no threads, no gimmicks, as they call them, no Confederates, no rigged-up table. The spectators can stand all around you, and anybody at all can do it. It used to cost $200 to learn to perform a miracle, but now it's only $1.50. You can panic your friends. You can get your girl. You can make yourself a big reputation. All you've got to do is have a rubber canary." It was funny when you thought about it in this way. I was relieved to be able to laugh, and I perhaps overdid my hilarity because Wilbur became almost hysterical. One of the things that delighted us most was the immediate social success which was promised with the torn-up paper that turns into a pair of ladies' panties, or the lighted cigarette that suddenly pops out of one's mouth. I began to fear, however, that Wilbur was losing control of himself, that his orgiastic laughter would be followed by a slump. The nurse looked in, and I left. When I dropped in on him again, 2 months later, I saw at once that he was nearly normal. Normality in persons we have always known in a state of overstimulation is likely to be disconcerting. We do not seem to recognize our friends in their new and quieter roles, and they themselves have not quite learned how to play them. I was at first rather baffled by Wilbur. He courteously took me for a tour of the grounds and explained the therapeutic methods in use in a way that was almost professional. His respect for the doctor who had been handling his case seemed to have grown into a deep admiration, and in discussing the other patients he would sometimes fall into a tone which suggested that he and the doctor were running the place together. We strolled back to his room. I looked around and saw a couple of golf balls on a chair. "You go in for golf?" I asked. "The dullest goddamn game in the world," he declared. He picked up one of the balls and held it between his thumb and first finger. "Watch," he said. A second golf ball seemed suddenly to appear out of nothing between his first and second fingers. Then a third ball, then a fourth, until his whole hand was full. "Marvelous," I said. "You do that well." He smirked in self-satisfaction and made them disappear one by one. Then he squeezed the last one up in his fist, appeared to be kneading it like clay, opened his hand, and it was gone. I applauded, but took it for granted that they had been shooting under his coat on elastics. "Listen, old egg," he said, "this is sleight of hand, not elastics." He took off his coat and rolled up his sleeves and showed me both sides of his hands. Then he plucked from the end of his left forefinger a shiny red billiard ball, about the same size as the golf ball, which he had tossed to me to show it was solid. He made it split up into two, like the cells in biological pictures, turned one of the red ones into a blue one by rubbing it with his palm, and then made the blue one breed blue ones. It was certainly a triumph for the doctor. Wilbur told me that he practiced every day. He had a magician come out to give him lessons. This was classical conjuring, he explained to me, which did not involve apparatus, and which actually required skill. "I call it classical," he said, "because the effects look so simple and chaste, and yet they involve a hell of a lot of calculation." I was impressed by the steadiness of his nerves, but he finally attempted too much in mixing red, white, and blue. He missed a move and lost his handful of balls, though I did not discover the secret. He angrily picked them up and flung them away in a drawer, declaring that he really could do it, in a tone that reminded me of his plaints when the professor at college had passed him by. I praised him and tried to reassure him, but he was still rather sunk when I left. This was winter. Rather late in the spring, I was invited by Adele to dinner. She said that Wilbur was out of the sanitarium. I found him looking so fit and behaving with so much aplomb that my previous respect for his doctor began to extend to Wilbur himself. He had now a kind of positive self-confidence that was different from his mere negative sobriety of the hospital. He drank no cocktails, no wine, and no brandy, and did not even seem to find this humiliating, as ex-drinkers are likely to do. And he did not show off much to the guests, though when he talked to them about their interests, he made it clear by the play of his left eyebrow and a certain slightly mocking tone that he did not take these quite so seriously as they did. These guests, besides myself, were the traveler who told about his travels, and who had now got to a point at which his only object was to be able to absorb enough alcohol so that he would not feel the normal inhibition against boring people with his stories. Wilbur's little first wife, who did not seem to be married at the moment, and who had evidently got somewhat queerer in whatever way it was she was queer, for she now had a nervous tic of wrinkling her nose like a rabbit, and one of those ladies with a salon who wants to admire talent, but always cultivates people like Wilbur and likes to gloat over their absurdities and weaknesses. After dinner, he took us to a nightclub, and I was very much amused by his anxiety to get there in time for the early show. I wondered whether it indicated a new regime which involved getting to bed by midnight. We sat, of course, right beside the dance floor. The first number was a German magician of a more or less commonplace kind. Wilbur watched him with the irony of an expert. When the man presently came over to our table and made Wilbur examine a small black velvet bag, from which he had just produced an egg, Wilbur insisted on taking the egg, and when he opened his hand, it had vanished. "Wise guy, eh?" said the magician, and reaching inside Wilbur's tailcoat, he brought forth first the egg, then a whole handful of eggs, then an imitation hen, and finally an imitation rooster, which gave a ventriloquial crow. The magician, with a chicken in either hand, went back to the center of the stage. Wilbur got up and followed him. "All right, old chap," he said, with a smile of appreciation. "Now let's see what you've got." It was embarrassing. Wilbur was incurable. "Oh, don't," cried Adele. "Let him go on with his act." But Wilbur had seized the magician and was extracting from inside his coat a fantastic succession of objects. First an enormous green snake, then a very long string of sausages. "I thought you had the accent," he said, "of a delicatessen dealer." Then a woman's brassiere. He stopped and lifted an eyebrow at his victim. And finally a handful of knives and forks, which he threw down with a loud clatter on the floor, setting off a flare of laughter from the audience, who had by this time become aware that the whole scene was part of the show. He gave the man's coat a last shake, and a whole hail of cutlery fell out, and was greeted by a general roar. Then he picked up a folding screen and set it around the magician, and clapped his hands in a signal to two waiters who were standing by. The waiters folded up the screen, from which the magician had vanished, and rapidly carried it out. The house broke into applause, and Wilbur bowed ironically but graciously. "Well, it looks as if Fritz has folded up," he said. "He was a hell of a fake anyway. Look at this." He picked up the snake and showed that it was a spring which collapsed. "That's fakery," he declared. "That's not magic. Let me show you what magic is." He took off his dinner coat, rolled up his starched cuffs, and showed his empty hands. Then he produced a red ball from one finger and went into the act I had seen. But he performed it now with much more ease and with all kinds of clever variations. The very amateurishness of his manner, he had no real magician's patter, but might have been amusing his friends, made his skill all the more impressive. And though the multiplying balls, I am told, are now a rather well-worn stunt, which is included in every child's box of magic, the trick had been worked up by Wilbur into something quite surprising and pretty. He would come down among the tables, for he played a long engagement at the nightclub, and make the balls hop in and out of sight, blinking brightly between his fingers, right under the spectators' noses. He even introduced an element of poetry by inviting members of the audience to summon the balls, and then producing special numbers supposed to be appropriate to the people. For the ladies, gold or silver or polka-dotted pink, or purple mottled with red. For the men, navy blue or mud color, or balls that were under or oversized. Sometimes a potato would appear, sometimes a gleaming crystal. Since he did not have to worry about expenses, he would always give the crystals away. Some of these features were refinements that he added as his engagement went on. But he was proficient enough that night, and the effect could not have been more dazzling to his friends, who had expected nothing. As a finish, he went back to the stage and picked up an opera hat and cloak, which the stooge had taken off at the beginning of the act. He showed that the hat was empty. One thing, he announced, I shall not do, I shall positively not do, I shall not produce a rabbit. He bowed and put on the hat. There was cordial applause. He bowed again, and as he took off the hat with a flourish, a big black ball that looked like a cannonball fell out with a thud on the stage. Wilbur set down the hat, got the ball back from a delighted party under whose table it had rolled, and examined it with curiosity. Then he laid it down, put on his hat, bowed in response to the clapping, and took it off again, and with a bang another bigger ball fell out. Wilbur, amid shrieks from the audience, looked after the cannonball, and stared into the hat with suspicion. "That's a damn treacherous topper," he said. He flattened it out with a slam, sent it skimming away over the audience, and took a final bow. When he returned from backstage to our table, we greeted him with noisy congratulation. It is always a relief when a very rich man who has insisted on having people play up to him exhibits some kind of real competence, and Wilbur had shown positive aptitude. This occasion, when he astonished our party, must have been the high point of his life. There was that tiresome, confounded traveler who had made him listen to stories about his marksmanship. There was his first wife, who had left him for a bridge expert and who had compelled Wilbur to hear a good deal about her husband's master mind. There was the scintillating lady with the salon, one of whose specialties for years had been telling funny stories about Wilbur, and who had come more or less to behave, even when he was actually present, as if he were a creation of hers. And there was I, who had jibed at him for his idleness. But hadn't he earned his triumph? He had found his necessity in himself. He had learned to do something well, and had made people recognize his mastery. He had always had the yearning to astonish people, and he was able to astonish them now by real imagination and dexterity, instead of merely by eccentric expenditure. "What did you think of the G major scherzo?" he asked. I hadn't particularly noticed the music. "Where they begin coming fast and the color changes. I tried to give the effect of Mozart. I begin with the andante, you see." I told him that the whole thing was beautiful. "I don't like the clowning at the end," he explained, "but you've got to have something to wow them." I was delighted by Wilbur the magician, and I used often to take people to see him, because he liked to have a party at his table when his scene with the stooge took place, and he, of course, always paid the check. It soon got to be the smart thing to sit with him, and he was usually surrounded at the second show on the later evenings of the week by his old crowd of hilarious friends, whose influence I sometimes thought was rather demoralizing for him. The lady with the salon upset him by telling him that the objects he produced from inside the stooge's coat were psychoanalytic symbols whose significance was obvious to everyone. And the alcoholic traveler spoiled the start of his act by reaching for the stooge's egg before Wilbur had had a chance to get it, and substituting for it an ostrich egg, which Wilbur was unable to manage. Yet I believe that the poor fellow could have survived all this if he had not had other forces against him. I dropped in one Tuesday night in the early days of summer, when the audience was rather slim, people were leaving town, and found Wilbur quite neurotic. He took a drink just before his performance, which I had never seen him do. He complained to me in a virulent whisper about the slowness of the waiter in bringing it, and the way he slopped the soda into the glass. And when the stooge pulled the chickens out of his coat, he said hatefully, and in none too low a voice, "Look out for my shirt, you damn fool." He skipped his finale with the cannonballs. He did not even pick up the hat and cloak, but bowed with an invidious curtness and insolently walked off the stage. When he sat down at the table again, and I asked him what was the matter, the poisons of fear and resentment spurted out in spasmodic mutterings. The stooge, he said, was sabotaging the act. This man was a professional magician, a German refugee, who had only accepted the job because he could get nothing else to do, and who now, according to Wilbur, had become so insanely jealous that he had taken to planting the cannonballs where it was difficult for Wilbur to get at them. I had noticed, in the searching of the stooge, that Wilbur had introduced a new and rather ugly detail. When he followed the magician to the platform, he would now rip out the whole of his shirt front, which was the kind you tie around the neck, and I think he was afraid of reprisals. I asked him why he didn't get rid of the man and hire a more reliable assistant, but this opened a new abyss. "If they don't get me first," said Wilbur. I asked him what he meant. It turned out that he was afraid of being fired himself. He had got the job through Jinx Ames, the daughter of a Morgan partner, who had had some success as a torch singer, and had put money into the club. He was convinced that Jinx, too, was jealous, and it was evident that he was jealous of Jinx, though his way of expressing his feeling was to say that she was ruining the show by the way she was mugging her songs. He was also at odds with the head waiter, whom he was finding it impossible to treat as he had treated head waiters in the past, and who, Wilbur insisted, now regarded him as on a social level not far from his own. At the same time, on an opposite principle, he had worked up a feud with the hat girl, who, he said, had lost his hat on purpose because he didn't give her a tip every night. After all, he was part of the club, and he oughtn't to have to pay like a customer. I could see that his position was confusing. It was as if I had been holding my breath. The end came inevitably and soon. He sabotaged the piano one night, putting chewing gum on several of the hammers, so as to spoil the accompaniment to Jinx Ames's songs, and then was so furious when she sang alone and went over better than ever that he refused to take part in the second show. He simply handed back the stooge's egg and allowed him to return to the stage. whereupon the professional magician embarked at once on his own line of patter, borrowed a 50-cent piece from one of the audience, and proceeded to perform, with tremendous success, the perfectly astounding trick in which the coin is made to disappear while the spectator still seems to feel it grasped in his hand. Afterwards, Wilbur and Jinx had it out in a terrific scene in which each one accused the other of taking dope and letting down the show. Adele had lost her influence over Wilbur since he had made himself a nightclub performer, and he threw up his job that night. As he said, he did not have to let the waiters ride him and be insulted by Jinx Ames in order to hang on to a salary. The German took his place. I saw him the night before he left for France, and again we sat up talking. I did my best to reassure him by telling him how good he had been, but he was afraid he had bought his success. He told me what I hadn't known, that he himself had put money into the club, and that he hadn't been taking pay. They hated my guts, he said. They tried to make me feel like a scab. I pointed out that the applause of the audience was an objective proof of his abilities. I used to pass out those crystals and jades, he said. They used to keep me going to get them. But I got goddamn sick of playing Santa Claus, so I quit handing out the presents, and just as soon as I quit, I flopped. I tried to tell him it had been late in the season, that no nightclubs did well in June, but he immediately fell back on a doubt which I found it rather difficult to deal with. What I do isn't art, he insisted, when I had wanted to convince him it was. You know damn well it isn't. It's a fake. I just did it as a stunt. It's not a fake, it's a trick, I said, and it's just as good as a trick as a sonata by Mozart is good as a sonata. Don't kid me, damn it, he answered. There's always that silly little shell that you slip the balls in and out of, and that the audience thinks is a real ball, and there isn't any way to get rid of it. The whole thing is just a bloody fake. What do you want to do, I asked, perform miracles? All art in that sense is a fake. Every work of art is a trick by which the artist manipulates appearances so as to put over the illusion that experience has some sort of harmony and order, and to make us forget that it's impossible to pluck billiard balls out of the air. But nobody I saw could convince him, since he had been spurred by no need to make money, that what he had done had been really worth doing, and he was unable, what was more pathetic, even quite to believe that he had done it. The magician who had taught him, he asserted, had invented the billiard ball routine. I saw that the conscience he had cheated in the days of the college rush had ended by becoming quite morbid. Part 4. This was the last real conversation that I ever had with Wilbur. The next time I saw him was much later, at a party that he was giving at his house to raise money for Loyalist Spain. In his immense uptown apartment, done in brand-new colonial style and full of delicate and tricky French clocks, which Wilbur was now collecting, we paid 50 cents apiece for cocktails. Wilbur performed with his billiard balls, and a popular Jewish comedian, whom Wilbur had known in his nightclub days, did a monologue and a song. A left singing group of young men and girls put on a sort of cantata in which Don Quixote and Carmen ended up by giving the communist salute. After this, there was a money-raising speech by Wilbur's latest wife, a wiry and fierce little woman, indestructible and inexpugnable as a caraway seed caught in the teeth, who had for years been an assiduous promoter of those communist organizations that disguised themselves as liberal groups. Adele, whom he had just divorced and whom he now considered hopelessly bourgeois, was going around the world with a devoted woman friend. Wilbur himself was beaming. He would slip about from one person to another, putting his arm around their shoulders, exchanging confidential information, grinning and nodding his head. I saw that I was surrounded by a brotherhood from which I was completely barred, and I was reminded by their too high-keyed cheerfulness of an evening I had once spent with the Bookmanites, that well-bred evangelical movement of which the house parties where sinners confessed had been one of the pastimes of the 20s. Wilbur saw me and came over to speak to me. "A big success, what?" he said. "We must have taken in $200. "I hope it really goes to the Loyalists," I answered, "and not just to communist papers and committees." I was a little bit sore at Wilbur because I had been invited to the party without being told its purpose, and had been asked to pay for my drinks. He tried to explain to me that the Daily Worker was red hot, a live wire, the only paper that told the truth about what was going on in the world. "It won't tell you the truth about Spain," I said. "It won't tell you that your Russian commissars are keeping supplies from non-Stalinist Republicans and shooting people who criticize the Stalinists, no matter how loyalist they are." "They only shoot renegades," he said. "Listen, old chap, I'm disappointed in you. I thought you were a progressive. I'm surprised to hear you sobbing about those rats. There's only one line up today, and that's between progressivism and fascism. You've got to be on one side of the fence or the other, and I'd be sorry to see you helping Franco. But I suppose the old rentier psychology is something it's awfully hard to throw off, that little place in Hecate County." I had wanted to ask him at first how he had reconciled his old ideal of government by the elite with his championship of Spanish republicanism. But as I watched him among his new friends, I perfectly understood what had happened. The communism of the later 30s, as instilled by his persistent wife, did not, of course, present itself to Wilbur as a democratic movement at all, but as a kind of exclusive club which was soon to dominate the world. And it had provided him at the moment he needed it with a role that both flattered his vanity and appeased his moral discontent, an occupation that was guaranteed always to remain entirely unreal and never to let him in for any final responsibility. And did it not also provide a revenge against a world in which he had found no place? With all this, he was encouraged by his coaches to go on living for the glory of communism exactly as he had done before. He could craftily enjoy the consciousness that in giving elaborate dinners and taking expensive trips, he was merely misleading people, and in reality serving a cause which was sure to triumph. As I saw him there, chuckling and weaving, I thought, remembering college, that he did look, and more than ever, like a decoy. But the greatest achievement of this phase of his life was getting on WPA. He was allowed to make a brief appearance in one of the theater project shows as a comic embodiment of capitalism, who produced a lot of things out of a hat, but finally broke down in his act and was denounced as a ridiculous impostor by shrill-voiced young people who represented the workers. His wife had had him smuggled in under the pretense that he was a destitute actor. When the theater project was abolished, Wilbur was out of a job, and he couldn't have been more bitterly indignant if he had been an expropriated sharecropper. Story number 4. The Princess with the Golden Hair. I had found in the course of the summer that I was watching Imogen Loomis at parties. I had been seeing her and her husband for years, but I had always thought them rather boring, on the middle-class side of Hecate County. Then my regular girl of that period had had to go out to Pasadena, where she spent 6 months of the year with her children, and I had suddenly started gazing at Imogen. I wondered why I had never noticed how sensationally attractive she was. I saw now that she was actually a beauty of an unusual kind. My idea on the evening when I first really saw her was that she looked like a fairy tale princess. She was wearing a white satin gown, and she had her hair done in a snood, not the kind of snood that later became fashionable, this was 1929, but a large bag of gilt net that caught it up so that it hung behind in a great soft round clot of gold. For Imogen did have golden hair. I had taken it for granted before, with my supercilious opinion of the Loomises, that the effect had been produced by Golden Glint, a hair wash then much advertised in the papers. But now I learned by inquiry and could see for myself that the gold was absolutely real. Not merely pale yellow hair, but hair that had sheen, that shone. Besides this, her complexion was smooth and fair, and her eyes were of a deep pigmented brown, of a kind that is rare in blondes and gives them something of the challenge of brunettes. She was tall, and when she had caught one's attention, one saw that her figure was beautiful too, a little bit fuller perhaps than was fashionable at the end of the 20s. She appeared to me that evening, as I say, like some swan princess or lovely Ilonka out of a Russian or Scandinavian story, who enchants one's imagination in childhood by way of those collections of fairy tales that were illustrated by H.J. Ford with wonderful pre-Raphaelitized types of straight-nosed and clear-browed English beauty. Yet she dressed on other occasions in quite different clothes, and reminded me of other heroines. Sometimes she wore robe de style, with tight bodices that brought out her breasts, and flaring, richly patterned skirts that gave her a gallant 18th century flavor. And sometimes she appeared with a loose-flowing gown and a sullen, voluptuous mouth that were obviously derived from Rossetti. What these costumes had in common, however, was that they were all quite outside the fashion and all unashamedly romantic. And going back over my previous impressions of her, I decided that my slowness in doing her justice had been due to this theatrical aspect. I was sufficiently conventional by instinct, I had to confess it to myself, to discount the beauty of a woman who shaded her eyelids and exploited her hair to play the role of the blessed damozel. But now that she had emerged from her background, all the other ladies suddenly faded. She had done nothing to attract my attention to her. I had thought her in the past rather shy, and I had long ago established with her a casual and cordial relation which I now found it rather hard to break through. But meeting her one day at Helen Hubbard's, where the atmosphere was always hearty, I addressed myself to her with the obvious intent of getting to know her better, and found her unexpectedly responsive. I had begun by thinking her commonplace, and then, when I had had my revelation, had for a moment stood a little in awe of her. But she seemed to me now more intelligent than I had supposed her to be at first, and more human than I had imagined her afterwards. She rose to my compliments and questions, I thought, like one of the rare rainbow trout in our little Hecate County river. You would bring up nothing for hours but the infantile and flapping sunfish, pretty in their green and yellow, but spiny, with no meat. Then you were jolted by a heavy pull, became steadily intent on playing it, and were amazed at reeling up triumphantly from those shallow, muddy pools of April so large and iridescent a creature. I felt now, on Imogen's part, the waking of an unexpected interest. It was as if she herself had not thought that I should ever make an effort to know her. I went the next Saturday to an enormous, indiscriminate party, solely in the hope of seeing her. I found her this time in a velvet gown, sumptuous and wine purple, with a white ruff that stood up so high and stiff that it made her look quite 16th century. She was wearing gold-embroidered sandals of the high-heeled kind then in vogue, that left the instep attractively unprotected, and she had parted her hair in the middle and plaited it in two gorgeous braids that were wound around her head like a diadem. She was sitting in a carved, high-backed chair. "You look like a panel," I said. "Your highball is a regular scepter." But I was soon at that point where I ceased to be conscious of any hint of fancy dress in her appearance. I was absorbed into the world she brought with her. I pored, standing over her chair, on her lovely and large brown eyes, the kind that people used to call liquid. They met me with quickness and vigor, though for some reason it seemed still inevitable that I should only be able to talk to her in banalities. She put out a cigarette, and I looked down on the coils of her hair encircling her maiden part, and on the stem of her long, round neck as it bent away from the ruff. How swan-like I had not before noticed, since her way of carrying her head, with its broad jaw and its jutting chin, prevented it from having its full value, and I was moved by a quality about them that I could characterize only as womanly. Womanly somehow in a way that seemed unlikely, because it was no longer in fashion, and which yet could still inspire respect, even perhaps adoration. I smelled her perfume. Too rich, too sweet. No. Why should she not be fragrant? How the lovers of the Renaissance must have made themselves drunk with perfume. "I want to tell you something," I said. She looked up. "But I don't think I can tell you here. Let's go into a room that's less crowded." "I don't like to move," she said, "once I've gotten settled somewhere. Can't you tell me here? There's too much noise to talk in this room, and I really have to make a speech." She looked at me again. "Let me finish this drink." I tried being amusing about the guests. She had been watching our host and Helen Hubbard. He was flashing his fine white teeth in his leathery and swarthy face that seemed now rather worn and battered, and Helen was giving him her wide, boyish grin and her frank and fun-loving laugh that could be heard across the crashing uproar. "Helen Hubbard," Imogen said, "is getting to be a real Amazon, isn't she?" We had so many strapping girls out there that I had not particularly noticed it, but in the light of my present comprehension of what it meant for a woman to be womanly, I saw that she was becoming mannish. "She'll never get married now," Imogen went on with conviction. "All she cares about is playing tennis." So completely had Imogen's world been seeming to me to exclude the common one that it startled me for a moment to hear her make the same kind of comment that another woman might make. But she soon turned romantic again. She remarked that our tall, dark host, whom nobody knew very well, reminded her of Jean Lafitte. "Yes," I answered, "this extraordinary house does look as if it had been built with pirate treasure." We went on in this harmless vein, which seemed stimulating and almost brilliant, as her eyes, under their noble brows, warmed with a humor that I had not suspected, and I saw as she lifted her head that her nose, which showed straight enough from other angles, was slightly turned up in a way that broke the line of her Nordic beauty, but gave her face an unexpected piquancy. "And now you must redeem your pledge," I said finally, when her highball was down to its dregs. "Did I pledge something?" I sound like an Arthurian romance. "It's something about the way you've got your hair. You promised to let me make you a speech. Let's go into the other room." "You bid me come," she said, dropping her eyelids and accepting the medieval role on a tone that was quite distinct from the kidding repartee of the era, almost as if I had met her in some fantasy which she had already enjoyed indulging. She got up from the chair with a dignity that seemed to me rather rigid. I thought that she was playing the queen with perhaps a little too much self-consciousness, and I reflected that she would be more graceful if she would allow herself to move more freely. I took her through the deafening living room and across the big dining room beyond, where the refreshments had been handsomely laid out, but to which no one had yet come to eat them. There was a library that opened out of this, and we invaded its shadow and solitude, and sat down on a red leather couch that was lighted by a heavy-shaded floor lamp. "What I want to tell you is this," I began, smiling sincerely with my eyes. "I've been thinking about you some time, and I've finally come to the conclusion that you are just about the most beautiful woman I've ever seen in my life." "Oh," she replied, and went on in a little girl womanly voice, which I had never heard her use before, and which seemed to me at first incongruous with the vision I had been having of her. "I've always heard that you were a great talker." "No," I insisted, "I mean it. I'm absolutely fascinated by you. I stare at you all the time." She smiled, looking straight before her, with a pleasure that, again to my amazement, seemed entirely naive and childlike. "Let me see you," I said. She turned toward me. I gazed at her with seriousness, bemusement, and she met my eyes, lowering her lids after a moment in a gesture half alluring, half ironic. I kissed her on her back-curling lips, and she held her face firm. But at the end of the third kiss, she turned her head away. "You know, you have a kind of beauty," I went on, taking her hand with its long, round, and smooth fingers,
that's really completely mythical. You're like Melisande, or Isolde, or somebody like that in a legend." She looked away and had her lips half open, and in her eyes that look of gratification. "It was funny," she still spoke in the little girl voice, which seemed to indicate a kind of submission, "your saying that I reminded you of Arthurian romances. Ralph used to say that I reminded him of the stories about King Arthur and the Round Table that he used to read when he was a boy." "With pictures by Howard Pyle." I knew what he meant exactly, but it annoyed me to have it brought home to me that her husband had discovered her first, that she had been dressing this role for him. "But you're a great deal more romantic than any illustration by Howard Pyle. You're the original thing. Before I saw you, I couldn't conceive that such people had ever existed. But I suppose there may really have been a Guinevere, and that she may have looked rather like you. But you have the human quality, too." I couldn't seem to avoid these phrases. "Guinevere was too sedate." "Guinevere wasn't always sedate. She had her moments of weakness, you know." "No, of course she wasn't, was she?" I smiled. I don't know why I forgot about that. "I must go back to the other room," she said, taking her hand away and opening the lid of her compact. "We've only been here about 3 minutes," I remonstrated. "Let me look at you 3 minutes more. Tell me something that is none of my business. Have you had very many men in love with you?" "Only one, Ralph." "I don't believe that." "Other people have talked, but they didn't really mean it." She shrugged, and the shrug had its coquetry, yet I felt at the same time that she was humble. "You know, it's very queer about you." I had suddenly the answer to my puzzle. "You're a beauty who doesn't behave like a beauty." "How do beauties behave?" "They expect to be admired and courted, and you don't really seem to expect it. When a woman who knows she's a beauty comes into a party like this, she assumes she's the center of attention, and usually makes herself so. Whereas you come in unobtrusively and go and sit somewhere against a wall. Then beauties get egotistic and inconsiderate of other people's feelings because they know that there will always be men who will keep on falling in love with them, no matter how badly they behave. But your beauty hasn't made you mean. You don't seem even to have any idea of the effect you can produce on people." "I can be mean, too," she said, bringing deliberately a Borgia-like cat look into eyes that might almost have been dog-like if they hadn't been superbly human, as if some deep competitive instinct had been awakened by my remark. "But really, you aren't mean," I said, "and you don't seem to know how wonderful you are." "I'm not wonderful." She put back the compact, and she seemed to shake off my flattery and become grown up again. "You just imagine I am. Well, all I can tell you is that I can't look at anybody else." "You've seen me around before, and I never could notice that it prevented you from looking at other people. There was a time when Roberta Evans was the only person around here you could look at, wasn't she?" she demanded bluntly. "There was a time when Roberta Evans was the only person around here you could look at, wasn't she?" she demanded bluntly. And she fixed me with humorous archness from under eyebrows plucked like moths' antennae. "That was because you always acted like a woman who didn't expect to be looked at, who didn't really want to be looked at." She abruptly got up from the couch. "I must go back," she declared. She had glanced away, listening with parted lips, and I felt she had not liked what I was saying. There were people in the dining room now. We could hear the jabber of voices. I followed her straight figure and wondered whether I had sounded patronizing. "When shall I see you again?" I asked. "I don't know." Then after a moment, "You must come to our house," she said. She greeted a woman friend, and at once began to talk with animation about their entries of dahlias at the flower show. "Shall I bring you something to eat?" "Please do." The friendliness was back in her eyes, and the kisses had given me confidence. I moved among the long, white-draped tables, and my eyes skimmed along over the silver knives and forks laid out in even rows, the big, gleaming silver coffee urn piping hot above an intense blue flame, and surrounded by an elegant brood of little gold-rimmed coffee cups, the polished white plates with their wide gold bands, on each of which was placed a white napkin, the pink ham and the ivory turkey, which a butler was beautifully slicing, the little sandwiches with cucumber filling, and the tender asparagus fingers daintily wrapped in bread, the Edam cheese in glossy red balls as full of meat as the yolks of great eggs, the delicious-looking chocolate cake laminated in very fine layers with a light creamy paste between. And I felt at that moment that Imogen, like the sandwiches and coffee and cake, was lying spread out before me, a rich repast to be had for the taking. I was just about to ask them to dinner, after a week had elapsed since the party, when Imogen wrote me a note. I guessed that she was too shy to call me, and invited me to dinner with them. Their house was a mock Elizabethan affair, half-timbered and built of red brick, with clustering triple chimneys, and diamond-paned leaded casements. It was shut off from the road by a neat brick wall, and I entered through wrought-iron gates, knobbed on either side with stone balls, and walked up a perfectly smooth flagged path among a variety of shrubs and small trees, yews and cedars, azalea and laurel, that crowded the rather narrow front lawn. These, in some cases, had been planted so close to the house, itself muffled in ramblers and ivy, that they must make it, I thought, rather dark. I knocked with an antique bronze knocker in the shape of an upside-down gnome at a door set in an ogival doorway and embellished with curly iron branches that radiated in from the hinges. The interior, though I told myself I ought to have foreseen it, a little depressed me at first, as indeed the whole household did. In the living room the walls were rough-finished in white, and the ceiling was ribbed with big stained beams, and there was a marble Elizabethan fireplace, elaborate with baronial carving and rather too grand for the room, which they had brought over from England. Some Elizabethan chairs, however, dark, high-backed, and spiral-legged, had evidently been relegated to the background in favor of more practicable furniture. On the walls were German-colored reproductions of Giorgiones and Botticellis, and an Italian Annunciation, saints' gowns of pink and gold, golden halos, in a paneled and columned gilt frame. And I noted in the bookcase at a rapid glance such items as Chatfield Taylor's Molière, a complete limited set of George Moore, Aucassin and Nicolette, J.A. Symonds' Life of Michelangelo and his History of the Renaissance, Vasari's Lives of the Painters in English, and a section of detective stories. The room was lighted only by candles in hydra-branched candelabra, and seemed swarming with Siamese cats. Imogen received me in a gown extravagantly medieval, which went even a little further than anything I had seen her wear before, and which I felt was directly connected with what I had said to her about King Arthur. It was a dullish autumnal green, and had a train and a high neck, as well as a novel kind of tight long sleeves that fitted over the hands like mittens, but left the fingers free. She wore also the snood of gold net which I had already so much admired, and on which I had complimented her. And I felt that she was playing up to my interest in her mythical heroic role, and had perhaps a little overdone it. As she rose and came forward to meet me, I noted again the rigidity which I took for affectation of grandeur. And the chair to which she returned, an hourglass of curved arms and clawed legs, reminded me of the chairs from which Hamlet, in old-fashioned Shakespearean productions, invariably delivered his soliloquy. But then she was so staggeringly beautiful. I was soon under her spell again. Ralph himself did everything that required effort. He made cocktails and handed hors d'oeuvres. He was a quiet and amiable fellow, not short, but not very tall, not homely, but not quite good-looking. It was easy to forget his appearance on account of his small, obscure eyes, of which it was hard to be sure of the color, and which rather deprived his face of focus. His most salient feature, not salient enough, was his nose, longish, straight, and pointed. His dark hair was smoothly brushed. His gray suit was perfectly pressed. There was no trace in anything he wore or said of Imogen's romantic imagination. He was one of those men in business, in a moderate but very sound way, who seem to live with the sole purpose of maintaining a margin of luxury that is always a little conspicuous, and which implies for them a position on some upper level. There were also Helen Hubbard, invited for me, and Ed and Kate Schwank, a commercial artist and his wife, who were special friends of the Loomises, but whom I knew only slightly. It was queer and a little uncomfortable to have cocktails by candlelight. I sat down on one of the Siamese cats. Ralph handed me a curious cocktail in a kind of aluminum goblet. It was pinkish, and he said it was an experiment, a noble experiment, he added, with applejack, grenadine, lime juice, and just a dash of Pernod. I asked Helen about the tennis tournament. We ate olives wrapped and skewered in bacon, caviar with grated egg, and tidbits of hot crab meat and melted cheese on little round pieces of toast. Ed Schwank went on telling a story in his harsh and high-strung voice from somewhere in the Middle West. "Well, I sent for the head waiter, and I said to him, 'Listen here, Herr Kellner, if this is calf's liver, I'm Christopher Columbus. And what's more, these new peas, as you call them on the menu, have been frozen for at least a year. And what's more, those blueberry muffins were baked about a week ago, and they ought to be on display in that antique store across the street as genuine Victorian paperweights. There isn't one single decent roadhouse where you can get a good dinner and a decent drink in the whole of Hecate County.'" There was a good deal of talk about food. My feeling, so strong at first that it chilled my social responses, was that Imogen's milieu was unworthy of her. But as the evening went on, I was forced to perceive how vital she was to her household, and how much she enjoyed her role. We had dinner by the light of more candles at a long refectory table. The meal, of which I remember the courses better than the conversation, had obviously been planned with enthusiasm. There were copious shrimp cocktails in Russian dressing, consommé enriched with sherry, Mexican enchiladas. They had spent the spring before in Mexico and were going through a Mexican period, with filling so fiercely peppered that it struck us in the middle of the dinner, when we were expecting the customary meat course, with a terrific intensification of the motif of the shrimps and hors d'oeuvres, brought moisture about our eyes and quite stopped the conversation. Then half avocado pears, brimming with peppery French dressing, and a compote of cut-up peaches, raspberries, and smooth white almonds, the whole washed down, as they say, with bootleg red Chianti in blue and green Mexican bottles. These bottles were effigies of the Virgin, and they provoked a good deal of amusement of a violently sophisticated kind. We had coffee and brandy in the living room. It was cold enough already for a fire, and the fireplace and the dinner and the candles were now lulling me and making me feel comfortable. I sank into it all, and I sat bemused by Imogen's claret-warmed beauty. When she was flushed, it brought out her high cheekbones, and her eyes in the candlelight seemed enchantingly both darker and brighter. She lay stretched out on a large French chaise longue, a real 18th century piece, more ample than the modern kind, and covered in chartreuse green, with a high carved cradle-like back. We talked about the pictures and the objets d'art, and the altarpiece by Fra Lippo Lippi at once led to Browning's poem. One of the Siamese cats kept jumping up on my shoulder, and when I would set it down in my lap, it would dig its claws through my trousers. But I was basking. My prejudice was dulled, and I even found Ralph sympathetic. Ralph Loomis was an advertising agent of rather a special kind. His job was to travel about and place in provincial newspapers the advertising of New York hotels and various brands of ginger ale and lipstick. This involved him in amusing adventures, and he was telling us of a visit of the spring before to Oklahoma City. He had been taken for lunch to the local men's club, where he had heard a great deal of talk about a sport called pulling the badger. Everybody seemed to be betting. He was invited to be present the next night at a bout or a match or whatever it was. The place was the club auditorium, which was festive with flags and refreshments. The records for the last 15 years had been posted up on the wall, and the members were studying them attentively. There was a pack of blooded hounds with a keeper, which they also examined with interest. Ralph was told that as the guest of honor, he had been chosen to pull the badger that night. A little speech of introduction was made, which was greeted with hearty applause. Then a box like a kennel with a small cage behind in which were seen lettuce leaves was brought in and set down on the floor. The entrance was closed by a shutter which could be lifted by pulling a string that ran through a hook in the ceiling. They handed Ralph the end of a rope, the other end of which was inside the kennel, and earnestly and carefully coached him. The rope was only 8 feet long, and he was told not to go too close, but just to give it a hard, straight jerk and quickly jump away. The spectators withdrew to the back and sides so as to leave him alone in the center of the room. The trainer had the dogs in leash and seemed about to unclip their collars. The man who was to lift the trap stood ready at a safe distance. A tense and expectant silence descended upon the room. The signal was a pistol shot. Ralph saw the door fly up. He steadily pulled the rope taut and felt a weight of resistance at the other end. Then he gave it a hard, straight yank. A white object came hurtling out, splashing some liquid as he leapt aside. It was an old-fashioned chamber pot. The climax brought a crash of laughter, almost as if we ourselves had been witnessing the hoax in the clubhouse. Helen Hubbard roared and made everybody else roar. Imogen had a shriek which was a little off-key and self-conscious, as if her acquaintance with me had been so far on such a high level that she feared I might be disillusioned by the coarseness of her husband's story. I didn't much like the shriek, and yet it was reassuring to know that she had also this earthy side, as I felt she would probably have called it. And one could not dislike Ralph, as I had fully expected to do. He had told his ridiculous story with a quiet and candid drollery, and there was something appealing about him. One felt that he was a little ashamed of his work. The business had been his father's. And it was funny to think of Ralph in his always correct city clothes, springing away from the perilous pot, though its contents, he made haste to explain to us, had been nothing but plain water. I had, besides, already discovered that his work took him away a good deal, and noted that he would be gone the next week. Ed Schwank, who was highly competitive, was now stimulated to tell at great length about fraternity initiations in some Middle Western college he had been to. I laughed heartily at this, too, and I talked at some length to his wife, who was wearing an embroidered Cuban shawl, but kept lit behind a rimless pince-nez, a beaming and motherly eye, about living in the country in winter and the problems presented by children. She had 3 sons, one almost out of Yale, one in his sophomore year, and one just about to enter. She was perfectly clear in her mind about the eventual careers of the younger boys, but she was worried as to whether the oldest one was going to be an artist or an engineer. Imogen talked about Italy. She and Ralph had visited the hill towns. She told me about some old trip that they had made through the mountains in a carriage, when the party just ahead of theirs had been held up and robbed by bandits. And the great Sienese festival, the Palio della Contrade, which was just exactly, she said, like going back into the Middle Ages, and about which she became rather tedious. I felt that if she and I had made this trip together, it would have all been entirely different, vivid with passionate love and colored by imagination on something higher than the guidebook level. We should afterwards have slipped away for a long and voluptuous holiday in some amusing little place by the sea where nobody ever came. The last time I had been in Italy, I had only done galleries and churches, and done them all alone. "Do you like to swim?" I asked. She had turned her head away to take part in another conversation, and did not now turn quite all the way back, but looked at me askance with her bright, steady eyes. "We don't go to the beach very much," she said. "Ralph gets cramps when he swims, and I," she went on after a second's pause, "don't care much for the water." It was true that I could not remember ever to have seen them at the local beach club, but I had an uncomfortable feeling that she had been able to look into my mind, and had seen me there, doting on her body, golden and Giorgionesque, as she lolled on the sand and looked out at the sea on the beach below our little pink villa. Some sally of Ed Schwank's caught her ear, and she went back to the general conversation, laughing loudly at Ed Schwank's imitation of somebody's bad golf. Yet I felt in her farewell no chill. She shook hands with me, still reclining, with a conscious touch of Madame Récamier, and I felt in the smile that she gave me some frank kind of acquiescence and gratitude. I waited before calling on Imogen till 2 days after Ralph had left. I did not phone, but simply went round, and I found her outside on the lawn, pruning a great crimson rambler. "It's the wrong time of year," she explained, "but it's keeping out all the light." She was operating intently and brutally, but with a certain ineptitude, lopping off enormous branches. She looked very charming and stately in a wide, flappy garden hat that gave her somewhat the air, she seemed always in costume, of a titled English lady keeping her hand in on a large estate. I tried to help her in her struggle with the rambler, reaching up and pulling down the higher shoots. The thing had been allowed to grow wild with a rankness that was almost repellent. The stems were nearly as thick as tree branches and had great thorns like the teeth of a circular saw. The blossomless sprays, when you tried to disentangle them, seemed actually to reach out and fasten onto you and grapple you into the bush in order to prevent you from clipping them. When we had finished, I picked up a sheaf from the ground. "Don't do that," she said. "They'll bite you. Let me put them in the basket. I've got gloves on." But there was much too much for the basket, and I loaded my arms with the biggest ones, that still seemed purposely to hook me and stick me with their diabolic barbs. We dumped them on a rubbish heap at the back of the house. Returning, we stopped to look at the garden. The air was dense and the day bright. In September, the grass was still gold in the sun, and things still had that velveted look that was characteristic of our climate. It was as if the blues and magentas and oranges and gamboges and reds had been given fresh coats of color, and the petals of the zinnias and dahlias had almost the tissues of flesh. There was a profusion of many kinds of flowers which had originally been planted in a formal design, but had now become rather confused and were brimming into one another's beds. And there were pallid and long-necked pansies and cornflowers sprawling on the ground that, as she said, she ought to have cut back. "It's so hard for me to kneel," she explained. The flower beds turned suddenly at the farther end into an ornamental vegetable garden, with gourds and yellow crookneck squashes that had been trained to grow on the wall, though some of them had dropped to the ground, and pumpkins that had been pedestaled on top of it, the way they have them in Italy. She had even more or less succeeded in training tomato vines to string prettily on low trellises their globes of yellow and red. As we slowly strolled back to the house, I dreamed pleasantly of a villa in Candeli, which I had visited years before. It would be fun, and so natural, so simple, to alight in such a villa and live there.
with the fine-looking Sienese maidservant who could neither read nor write, the heavy-beamed, cool-tiled studio, which could be equally used as a study, the yellow-stemmed coffee cups for breakfast with their scrollery of the Renaissance, the wide, round-arched Tuscan doorways and the windows full of flowers and leaves and light, with the sheer drop below to the Arno, green and opaque as a pigment on a panel. Over everything, as far as one could see, the copious, appeasing sun, and inside, the appeasing of desire on the broad, low Italian bed that seemed meant for nothing else. This old-world mood on my part was picked up as we crossed the lawn by the side of a small staircase with an iron rail that ran up the side of the house. "Where does that go?" I asked. "It just goes to the second floor." "It looks quite romantic," I said, "as if it led to an historic chamber." She walked toward it, and I found myself following her up. "I feel as if we were going to see the Glamis horror," I remarked as we climbed the steps. "I'm afraid we haven't got any ghosts," she replied after a moment's silence. I imagined she had stopped to think and did not know what the Glamis horror was. It was supposed to be a monster, not a ghost, but I did not correct her, and we said nothing more till we had got to the top of the steps, and she had opened a little Gothic door, which was dark-stained and iron-hinged. The door gave directly on a bedroom, cool and white-walled, with drawn shades. It smelled of woodwork and linen, and was dominated and rather crowded by a great Elizabethan bed with spiraling, bulging bedposts, and a great flat-topped wardrobe that matched it. The somber magnificence of these was relieved by a few bright ornaments, a pair of pompous Chinese roosters, a clay garland of Mexican fruit, and a doorstop in the effigy of a marching grenadier. "We brought it from England," she explained about the bed. "We don't sleep in it any more. It took up so much space in the room, so now we give it to guests." She shot up some of the shades. I studied, propped on a table, a framed Elizabethan ballad, the story of David and Bathsheba. It was a broadside with crude little woodcuts of men dressed in swords and cloaks, and women in feathers and ruffs. Her beauty was more excellent and brighter than the morning sun, by which the king, incontinent, was to her favor quickly won. She stood within a pleasant bower, all naked, for to wash her there, her body, like a lily-flower, was covered with her golden hair. The king was wounded with her love, and what she was he did inquire. He could not his affection move, he had to her such great desire. "She is Uriah's wife," quoth they. "You know," I said, "every time I see you, you remind me of a different period, and sometimes you remind me of several periods all merging, like a multiple exposure. It's as if you were all the beautiful women who had ever gotten lodged in men's minds." I took her hands. "Let me look at your eyes," I said. She held her head aside, masked by the heavy brim. "Please." She lifted her face, and it seemed a little stubborn and scared, as if she thought that I wanted to scrutinize her in some curious or critical way. But I told her how wonderful she was, and kissed her in solemn admiration, and stared again at her eyes, which now seemed both tender and bold. I made her sit down on the bed, which had nothing but a sheet on the mattress. "I never thought I'd know you," I said, taking both her hands together. "You seemed like a romantic vision, the kind of thing one can't get over to from reality." "I never thought I'd know you either." It was the yielding little girl voice. "You still don't seem," I pursued, "to belong to the real world I live in. You don't belong with ordinary people." "You're not like other people either." "We have something very deep in common." "I don't know. We hardly know each other." "We neither of us live in Hecate County. We're strangers among all these suburbanites. I'm really only interested in things that don't exist for them, history and art and all that. And you somehow belong to the world of those things. Was I being a little maudlin? As no other woman has done that I've ever known. I don't know where I belong, she said. She sat looking away, as she so often did, her big hat partly hiding her face. I tried to take it off, but she held it on with one hand and said, "No, don't. I want to see your wonderful hair. You know you have the most wonderful hair that I've ever seen in the world. It's like something that a princess lets down from a tower. Let me take it off." She carefully removed the hat, and with her smooth hands smoothed down her braids. I kissed them with a kind of ardor that partook both of reverence and of passion. But though I was summoning the pictures in the legends, I did not seem to be realizing the excitement that I had thought I should feel about her. Her hair, in this half-shaded light of the room, looked simply extremely blonde. I was putting my arms around her and was on the point of kissing her mouth when she pulled herself away from my embrace. "Don't do that," she said. "Why mustn't I?" "Because I don't want you to." She had shifted her seat on the bed. "I don't like to be held," she said gently. I leaned over to her and kissed her without touching her with my hands. The kisses were quite real, and she returned them. She was certainly a real woman. She had that odor of a woman perspiring in a clean but light summer dress that took me back to the summers of my childhood, when outdoor romps with little girls in the shrubbery had taken an amorous turn. Yet her edict that I must not embrace her made me feel, as I went on kissing her, that she was somehow a sacred object from which I was still debarred. But perhaps it would be like the hat. In a moment I should try again. In the meantime, I went on talking. "Who are you?" I asked. "Where do you come from?" "I'm a myth," she replied with her coquetry. "But what part of the world do you come from? Or are you a universal myth?" "I was born in Minnesota." I could see it was a reluctant confession. "But I've lived in the East since I was 14. "Have you got any Irish blood?" "My father was born in Ireland, in County Galway. My mother's people came from Sweden." "Then you are a universal myth. You're Brunhilde and Iseult in one. I think you're really more like Iseult, though. But Iseult's eyes were blue, of course. Yours are much more exciting. Close them. Let me see how they look." They were amazing. She had great rounded lids with lashes that were darker than her hair, very noble and yet provocative. I kissed one and then the other. They were a little oily with sweat. Then I kissed her again on the mouth, and she seemed to respond with eagerness, pressing her lips against mine. I put my arm around her shoulder and my hand against her cheek, but immediately she shrank away. "Please don't do that," she said. Then, adorably soft and lisping, "Just kiss me." I put both hands on her ears and the coils of her hair. Then I put them on her cheeks, which were flushed and hot. The logic of the situation impelled me to force her backwards, dropping one hand to her waist and trying not to bear on her shoulders. But she righted herself and slipped away. "Don't do that, please," she repeated appealingly, and yet with authority. In an ordinary affair of the kind, I should have pressed her with, "I want you so much I can't think of anything else," or something of the sort. But with her I did feel that it was vulgar to attempt to go to bed with her thus out of hand on a sheet in a closed-up guest room, and I tried to play a worthier role. "I'm sorry," I said, "but I adore you so, I don't know what to do about you." "There's nothing to do." She had been leaning back, propping herself with her hands, her lids half-veiling her eyes, but now she stood up with decision. "I must go downstairs," she said, and straightened her hair in the mirror. Over her shoulder I watched in the glass the reflection of her anxious brown eyes, which seemed to me shining with love and aching with the strain of the moment, and her mouth that I had kissed, half open. I kissed her again before we left, and she quickly turned her lips away afterwards. I followed her out into the hall and downstairs into the wainscoted and tapestried smell that, like everything about the Loomises, was several degrees too rich. I noted little carved heraldic lions poised upright on the newel posts. "Wonderful little lions," I commented. "That's Ralph's coat of arms," she said. They had had it looked up, she told me, by the College of Heralds in London, and then had the lions made by a wonderful old German woodcarver in Brooklyn. "Would you like a cocktail?" she asked. We made a Manhattan in the kitchen, which was quite non-Elizabethan, and equipped with the latest developments in electric refrigerators and electric stoves. It was the maid's day out. We brought the cocktail things into the living room and set them down on a little low table. This table was made of tiles that had Goya's caprichos on them, and we talked about Goya and his queer imagination and his affair with the Duchess of Alba. I had pointed out the Duchess in one of the pictures and spoken of the part she played in them. "Oh, yes," Imogen picked it up promptly. "The Duchess of Alba was his mistress, you know, and when she was banished by the Queen to her country estate, Goya went right along with her, and the Queen had to pardon the Duchess to get Goya to come back to Madrid." I had noticed that she did not like to be told things, but was always impatient to tell. "I suppose she was really quite remarkable," I went on, with a quickening enthusiasm. "She must have had a certain amount of brains, as well as being extremely beautiful. She posed for the Murha portraits, you know. I've always thought it rather amusing that the one that's described as vestida should have been thought to be less improper than the one that's described as desnuda." "Yes, he painted it because her husband had heard that she was posing nude. The Queen was very jealous of her and burned down the Alba Palace. They were wonderful people, weren't they, the Spaniards? She used to send Goya dinners on magnificent silver plates, and according to Spanish custom, the dishes couldn't be returned. They were a present that went with the dinner." "Yes, you have to have wastefulness, I suppose," I said, "to get the really greatest kinds of art." "Yes, I know." She seemed a little chagrined. "I can't be wasteful, though." "Why can't you?" She did not answer my question. "If I'd been the Duchess of Alba," she added, "I'd have had Goya come to stay with me in the country, and I wouldn't have cared about anything." I did not quite grasp the point she was making, but she said this with a force and a boldness that made me believe in her greatness of spirit. "It's the Irish in you," I hastened on. "It's just as Yeats said, 'Only the wasteful virtues earn the sun.' The Irish people produce great writers because they're temperamentally prodigals. They're willing to squander their lives on the gratuitous work that great art demands, whereas the Scotch, on the contrary, are only really good at economics and moral philosophy, two departments in which the object is to minimize waste, whether of money or stress and strain, through accurate calculation. The Scotch are a fake in the arts because they always have to pretend that they're producing something more than they've paid for." "You talk so brilliantly," she said. "You're really a brilliant man, aren't you? I've never known a brilliant man." I can't say I wasn't flattered by this, but it rather stopped my flow of ideas. And in a moment she looked at her wristwatch and announced, "I'll have to go and get dressed. Edna Forbes is coming at 6:30 to take me out to dinner." We kissed goodbye in the hall. I was ardent and loyal. She was loyal, too, but did not linger. I asked when I should see her again. "Are you going to the Fergusons Saturday?" I was. "Well, I'll see you there." I saw her at the Fergusons and took her aside and paid her such court as was possible, but she didn't want to see me Sunday. Ralph was coming back that night. Then I had to go away for 2 deferred summer visits. Then Ralph had his vacation in September, and he and Imogen took a motor trip to Canada. Then they went to New York in October, and I found myself alone in the country, wondering what had happened to extinguish an affair of such promise. I succeeded in having lunch with her, however, one day when I went to town. I took her to a good little speakeasy, smart, expensive, and dark, where her face, under a felt cloche hat, in the light of the pink-shaded lamp, glowed tantalizingly out of the shadow like a glamorous movie close-up, detached from its trunk and untouchable. We talked about the people in the country. I told her how much I missed her, but at 2:30 she had an engagement. Ralph was away again now, but it turned out that she had made an engagement for every dinner and lunch during his absence. I took her where she was going in a taxi, and in the taxi kissed her much. "We mustn't see each other," she said. "Why mustn't we?" "Because I'm married." "You've been married for 16 years, and Ralph has had you all that time. Don't you think I deserve something, too? I love you." I was sober and earnest. "I'm in love with you, don't you know that? Please don't refuse to see me." "I'll see you sometimes," she said, "but you mustn't be in love with me." "Why not?" "You don't really know me at all." "I want to, though." "You wouldn't like me." "I'd like you more. I'd appreciate you more than anyone else has ever done." "Would you?" She was pleased again, and looked away out the window. "You'll see," I said, with quiet certainty. We were pulling in at the Ritz, where she was going to have her hair done. "Don't kiss me here," she said, and quickly got out of the cab. Part 2. It may be that there is nothing more demoralizing than a small but adequate income. I had been a pretty good student at college and had stayed on to get a Ph.D., but I inherited some money from a sister of my mother's and decided to drop my thesis. I had specialized in economics. My father was an expert accountant who had first worked for the bigger insurance companies, and then had made himself a position as what came to be called a management engineer, that is, a mathematician who figures out budgets and methods for grasping corporations. And I had been slated for something of the sort. But I loathed the idea of Detroit, in which my family now had to live, and I was interested in economic theory rather than in studying the sales and costs of the General Tires Corporation. So I had made up my mind to teach. I had, however, been affected by the radical wind that had blown at the end of the war, in which I had been too young to take part, and had come to be repelled by the indifference of my father and the employer's world that he served to the human needs of labor. I had called myself a socialist at college, and had found myself more and more at odds with the college economics department, where the professors were mainly apologists for the bankers on the board of trustees, or people of the dry goods and grocery type, who had a sympathetic interest in business without the competence to be businessmen. I had also, with no talent of my own, a very great enthusiasm for art. And what I really wanted most to work on, and what the categories of college had no place for, was an historical study of painting in relation to its social economic roots. I decided to take advantage of my income to go into the subject for myself, but the pressures of 1919 gave way to the spending of the 20s. I went to Europe to see the museums and stayed there for nearly 3 years. Life, of course, for an American was easy abroad, but then when I came back to New York, I found prices that made it hard to live in comfort. I had relatives in Hecate County, and I was able to rent from friends of theirs a most remarkable little place in the woods, situated on a charming little river, for considerably less than it was worth. I got to like the long, quick drives between houses and the long drinks screened in by foliage, though I often told people they bored me, and my work, since I had settled in the country, was becoming rather desultory and languid. That summer I had hardly written anything, but had only read at histories of art and dense books on social background. And now suddenly I found myself dissatisfied. The effect on me of the revelation of Imogen had been to make me feel rather worthless. I was carping and sulking in my tent. I was shirking the dust and heat. Such phrases came inevitably to mind. I was missing something very important, the real dignity and glory of life. After all, despite his limited intelligence, Ralph Loomis had in some sense earned Imogen. Had he not given her an Elizabethan country house, the certainty of winters in New York, and all those travels in Europe and America? And what did I have to offer her, aside from my superior taste and my brilliant conversation? I knew that I must do something, be something. Jo Gates, my regular girl, who was at present in California, had never made me feel like this. First of all, I must finish my book. But for that I needed libraries, museums, the society of intelligent people, and I needed to be nearer Imogen. I was not actually very near her in town when I finally found an apartment. She was staying in the East 50s at the Vanderveer Hotel, and I landed just below 14th Street. The rents in Greenwich Village in those days had gone up to join the uptown rents, and anything really good was away beyond my resources. But I took for $65 a month, which was more than I paid in the country, a single large room and a bath on the top floor of a house in West 12th Street between 6th and 7th Avenues. I moved in some of my furniture and pictures, and it was really not terribly bad, though I hated the daybed that was also a couch. At least it was an old red brick house with a white door and a little brasswork, which the landlord kept painted and polished. Not one of those awful places with fire escapes on the fronts and gummy yellow walls in the stairwell. Between the first days of November, when I came to live in town, and the end of the Christmas holidays, I had a life in which I was at least fully occupied. I read purposefully, took notes, looked at pictures, and lay on my back on the confounded couch, having maddening daydreams about Imogen, or walked the floor late at night under the stimulus of a couple of drinks, trying to work out a strategy to win her. I was invited to the parties she gave, and I cultivated her flavorless friends with the object of getting asked to their parties. I occasionally met Imogen for a drink or took her to an exhibition, and there were moments of silence and sighs, and moments when she told me she couldn't believe that she could ever so seriously matter to a man about town like me. It seemed to me by Christmas that I was lapsing to the level of an insipid little comedy that she amused herself by playing in public.